What's the difference between a keyboard editor and a mouse editor? A keyboard editor uses primarily shortcuts to place things on the timeline, to add in and out points, to move their footage around. And a mouse editor doesn't touch the keyboard. A mouse editor just clicks, clicks, and clicks. Neither, I would say, are wrong, but both are missing out on some speedy alternatives. The fastest editors use a good combination. Alright, let's look at these wonderful pointers. The tools in the toolbox. We'll go straight down this list and look at every mouse pointer. The first one we all know about, it's the selection tool. That's the main default pointer. Next we have track forward. I press A to select, and it gives me a double arrow pointing to the right. If I click anywhere on the timeline, it selects everything from there and moving forward. See here, here, it selects what's underneath it and everything beyond. With a few more instances, it may be easier to see. See, I select here, 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 everything beyond it. And if I hold shift, it converts to one arrow and will do one track at a time, as you can see here. Pressing shift A does the exact same thing but backwards with a double arrow, or if you hold shift, you can select one track at a time. Next is the ripple edit tool. Press B and you'll see the arrow turn yellow when you're able to use it. By clicking and rolling back, I'm ripple editing that footage away. It does the same thing as if I made a cut here, select here, and did a ripple edit. But I can undo and do this with the ripple edit tool. The rolling edit tool is selected within, where I can take two clips adjacent to each other, click in the middle, and drag their connection point. It'll make the first clip longer and the second shorter if you do it this way, or the other way around by dragging to the left. Next is the rate stretch tool. The shortcut is R. This will take this piece of footage, you press R, and go to the end of the clip. Let's zoom in on this clip. With the rate stretch tool, I go to the end and track back about halfway. Instead of making this clip shorter, you see a percentage here. That means the clip is now sped up. You can see it here. I'll undo. We see the cars going at normal speed right now, but let's take the rate stretch tool and smash it pretty close together. Let's look at it now. See the cars moving fast? That's because I increased the rate with the rate stretch tool. This is a very handy tool to make sure that your edits fit in the precise time that you need them to fit in. Sometimes I'll have a small gap like this in my footage and need this clip to fill the time. So I put it there and I'll rate stretch it out so it still works in between those two clips. Then, if I have to move this back for some reason and I need to rate stretch it again, I can just compress the entire clip with the rate stretch tool and still have all the footage in that smaller gap. Next is the blade tool, which we've all used. The shortcut is C for cut, so we can call it the cutting tool. The next two tools, it took me a while to learn. They're the slip and slide tools. First, slip by selecting Y. To show you the slip tool, I'm going to use a different video. We'll use this time-lapse pregnancy video. So I'm going to cut this to about half. We see she starts with a flat belly and starts to get more pregnant. Now I'm going to use the slip tool and drag on top of this, and I see the in and out points at the top and let go. Now let's look at the beginning. We start in the middle of the pregnancy and then go straight to the baby shot. It still starts at the same spot and ends at the same spot, but the piece of footage it shows is different. That's the slip tool. I'll slip back to the beginning, and then I'll slip to the end. The slide tool is more like a selection tool. I'll grab this clip, move it over here, and it moved naturally, just like a selection tool. I'll move it over here, the same thing, and I'll move it right next to this last clip, but I can't drag over it. Now when these clips are next to each other, if I drag this over, it will extend the connected shot. This works really well for a shot in between two other shots. Let's use this as an example. I'm going to put this right in the middle. I'm going to put this pregnancy video right between the two New York street shots. Now with the slide tool, I can move this over this way or move it over that way, and the three shots added together still time out the same. The pen tool I mainly use for masks, but you can also use it to draw shapes, and we'll put a graphic right on your timeline. The same with the rectangle tool or the ellipse. And don't forget you can hold shift to make a perfect circle or a perfect square. Next are the zoom and hand tool. I'm guessing you've probably used these a lot. The magnifying glass with a plus symbol will take you closer and closer into the timeline, and if you hold Alt or Option, it will zoom out. And when you're zoomed in, you can use the hand tool to scoot the timeline around. It doesn't change the location of your clips, just what you can see on the timeline. The last tools are Type Tool and Vertical Type Tool. Type Tool will let you type on screen, and Vertical Type does exactly what you're thinking, lets you type vertically, right in the program window. That's all the pointer tools. I'm sure you're accustomed to using some of them, but try to get more and more comfortable with the ones you're not. Speaking of, I need to try out this slide tool a little more. I want to say a few things about blending modes. Not too deep, but just a few small quick tips. Here I have a JPEG on top of some footage. And here under opacity, where I can change the opacity, I have blend mode, where I can change the blend mode. The blend modes are divided into different sections. These are your normal and dissolve. These are the darken ones, darken, multiply, color burn, linear burn, darker color. The lightens are in the next area. The contrast are in the next area. The next to last are the comparative, and the bottom are color related. In the darken section, mainly it's ways to get rid of the white in your picture in different ways. If we select darken, it gets rid of all the white, leaves the black hello, and the white hello over here, it makes it transparent. Multiply does a very similar job. Color burn does the same thing, but leaves a little clarity for some of the colors to come through. And then lighten does pretty much the opposite. It gets rid of all the black, makes this black, it still looks black, but it's clear. Screen does something pretty similar. Color dodge does what color burn did. Overlays are somewhere in the middle. Let's try something else. Here, if you press darken, it gets rid of all the white, but you can barely see the M. Multiply, you can see it a little bit better. That's kind of a cool effect, but in this case, I'm not sure how you would use it. You can really find some cool effects sometimes. Blend modes for me have always been sort of trial and error, but when I'm looking for something specific, I'll scroll through a lot to see what gives me the best effect that I'm looking for. If you're used to Photoshop, you know a little bit about these. Sometimes I'll find some really cool effects by using a blend mode on a photo on top of some video, but what I mainly use it for is to key out a black or a white from a graphic. Have you ever heard of an alpha channel? What does that mean? Well, in a photo or a piece of video, every pixel is a certain color. But what if it's a graphic with a clear background? That clear background is part of the alpha channel. If you think of each pixel as a different color, it has RGB colors. Red, green, blue. So a certain amount of red, that's one channel. A certain amount of green, that's another channel. And a certain amount of blue, that's a third channel. Most video and pictures have these three channels, red, green, and blue. But for a transparent background, none of those colors exist. But if you tell a computer red equals 0, green equals 0, blue equals 0, it's going to show black. And that's not what we want. So you have to define a new channel to the computer, an alpha channel. It's a way of telling the computer there is no color here. Please show whatever is behind it. Alpha channels can exist in still photos, graphics, or in video. For still photos, most of the time I use JPEGs, but when I need a transparent background, I'll use a PNG which can have an alpha channel. Therefore, JPEG versus PNG. And for high resolution video, a very high resolution video is ProRes 422. But if I want an alpha channel, usually for a graphic, I'll use ProRes 4444. This file type, because a ProRes 4444 can hold an alpha channel, so I can have the graphic and a clear background. Frame rates. The most common frame rates these days are 29.97 or 23.98. For a brief history on frame rates, when cameras were first being invented, they were shot at a certain number of frames per second, and when they were projected for movement to look normal, they had to be projected at the same frame rate. If the projector showed them too slowly or too quickly, people's movement would not look normal. So filmmakers generally decided that about 18 frames per second would show smooth enough movement, and they could make it a standard for projectors to show movies at the same speed they were shot in. But later on, since 18 frames per second looked a little bit choppy, this got changed to 24 frames per second. You've probably heard 24 FPS, or 24 frames per second, as some piece of movie terminology. Because of this major change, when you watch some old silent films that were shot at 18 frames a second, Some of the characters look like they're running around quickly because it's now being projected at 24 frames a second. What does that have to do with Premiere? The good thing about Adobe Premiere is whatever you shot your footage at, it can show you at the same speed. And if you've shot multiple speeds, it will make its own adjustments internally so nothing looks sped up or slowed down. But when you watch it frame by frame, you'll occasionally see some blurring that was not originally there. As a best practice, you want your sequence to reflect the speed and frames per second that you shot your footage at. I think 29.97 looks a little bit more like TV or video, and 23.98 frames per second looks a little bit more like a movie. Most people will never notice what frame rate your footage is in. It will mostly be a subconscious feeling, oh, this feels more like a movie, or oh, this feels like a TV show. So make sure your frame rate matches your footage. Most semi-professional cameras will let you change the frame rate according to what you want. Also, in some parts of the world, 25 frames a second or 50 frames a second is a standard. These frame rates are usually referenced as PAL, P-A-L, and other standards I've mentioned before, NTSC. You may have seen these letters somewhere before, like on the back of a DVD case. Most modern TVs can show any frame rate you give it, but older TVs could only play the local standard. Something else that has to do with frame rates is interlaced versus progressive frame footage. In progressive frame footage, it's what we think of as film. Take one frame of video, move on to the next one, take another frame, move on to the next one, take another frame, and show those frames in rapid succession so everything looks like it's moving. Interlaced footage shows a smoother movement, but it divides the whole screen into A and B lines. If you drew horizontal lines left to right all the way down the screen and labeled them A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, interlaced footage would take a picture and only fill in all the A's, and then on the next frame, fill in all the B's. On the following frame, the B would remain the same, and it would change all the A's. This will be in such rapid succession that you probably won't notice it. But if you're using old video or old TV recordings, you may see these jagged edge lines because of the interlacing. And that's probably way more than you need to know about frame rates. But as a more informed editor, you can make better choices on how to show your footage. Let's go through all the panels and see which ones you need. Source. This shows me the video that I have selected in the project window. It's very useful. Effect controls. This one's useful. This is how I scale and reposition footage on the timeline. Lumetri Scopes. I don't find this is always useful, but it really is when I'm coloring. The audio clip mixer. This window is helpful when you're concentrating on audio, but generally, I leave it turned off. Audio track mixer. This can change your levels. This is an easy way to control your audio graphically, make changes with the balance, the levels, and see it all at the same time. It may be very useful when you're concentrating on audio. The capture window is used when you're inputting footage from a camera or something like that. And edit to tape is the exact opposite. It's when you're going out of the computer into a tape deck or an old video camera. Adobe Story I have not logged into. The progress window has to do with making proxies, but I've never used it before. The program window is one of the most important. It shows you what's on the timeline. This title window is the way to make legacy titles. But now with the new titling tool, you won't need this. The reference panel can be very helpful sometimes when you're color correcting. If I put it right next to here and I have this selected, when I scroll in the program window, the reference window changes as well. But if I unselect this, move it over here, and this can show part of my timeline, but a different location. This can be very helpful if you have two shots and you want to compare their saturation. I have New York Street and a saturated baby video. If I gang them together, when I scroll here, it's exactly the same. What use is that? I can ungang them, move this here, and change the look of this to match the previous shot. But I don't use it that much. The info panel is over here. It gives me a lot of great info, but I don't need that all the time, so it stays closed for me. The effects, I use these a lot. This is where all the audio and video effects are found. The essential graphics panel, I'm learning more and more about, and learning to like even more. You can build custom graphics here, and there's a lot of graphics already built in that can be very helpful for quick video creation. Essential sound is very similar, but with music, sound effects, etc. Lumetri Color, I only use this when I'm coloring, but it's a very powerful panel. Metadata, this is a great window to have, but I rarely use it because I usually need one piece of this data at a time. The markers panel I usually use as a pop-out panel when I'm classifying footage. Your history panel is so you can see everything that you've done and go back to a specific point. The captions window is for specific jobs when you're using closed captions on your video. The Events panel lists warning, error messages, and other information you can use to identify and troubleshoot problems, particularly those associated with plugins or other components from third-party developers. I basically never look at this panel. Legacy title, then there are these 4 legacy titling panels, which if you weren't using them before, you don't need to start, because Adobe has given us new ways to do these same processes. And this big timecode window can be very helpful if you're showing producers footage to give them notes on a particular scene, an entire movie, or a video, so they can clearly see where you are on the timeline and make notes. Here we have the audio levels window, which is nice to usually leave open because it doesn't take up that much room, and you can see how your audio levels are doing. However, I usually leave it closed until I'm concentrating on audio at the end of my project. The sequence window is your timeline window. You can't do a lot of editing without this. Your tools window, once you know the shortcuts, you can get rid of this window, but while you're still learning them, it might be nice to keep them on the screen. Your project panel is where all your footage lives. You'll usually need this available. I always keep mine open. The media browser panel can be very powerful in some ways, but I usually drag things in from Finder and navigate that way, so I leave it closed. And your libraries panel can be very useful for seeing lots of graphics at the same time. And that's it. What is metadata? Metadata is the additional information in a file that is not part of the file itself. For example, on an iPhone, you can group the photos by the location that they were taken in. That information is not written on the photo itself. Where is it? It's in the metadata. The camera on an iPhone is set to automatically record where the photo is being taken and write that into the metadata of the photo itself. In Premiere, we can see a lot of different pieces of metadata in the program window. Let's take a look. In this video, we see the frame rate is 25 frames per second. We see the media duration is 48 seconds. And the dimensions are displayed here. Or in this photo, there is no frame rate, but the pixel dimensions are displayed here. If we scroll over, we can see additional metadata that's saved here. For example, this is the creation date. This is the date and time the resource was originally created. And if I right-click on the bar at the top, I can click Metadata Display. To see a list of a lot of different pieces of information I can display in the program window. This includes the file path and file name of the file itself, if there are captions included on the video, or in addition to the creation date, I can also see the modification date, the time the file was changed last. Or if it's a PDF, I can see what keywords are attached to the PDF. Some of that metadata can be very helpful in organizing your files. When you go to export something, it always asks about the compression settings, or the bitrate. But what is compression? In order to get a video file smaller and smaller and not record the color of every single pixel on every single frame, programmers have developed shortcuts in order to save space. One of the ways is referencing the frame before when playing the video. So for example, if frame 300 looks like this and frame 301 looks like this, the only difference is her head slightly moves and her eyes close. So in frame 301, instead of the file having to define what the colors for every single pixel are, it can group a lot of pixels and say all of these pixels refer to previous frame colors. And in the eye area, that's where the colors are more clearly defined. Another way to save space is by grouping colors. So for example, in this dress, it's red, but there are several different shades of red. There's the shadows down here, the bright parts right here, and we see some folds in the dress here. The more compression that's put on here, the more unified of a color this entire red will be. Here's a high compression render that I exported. We see all these different blocks. The computer is saying this section of pixels is this one shade on average, so we'll display it as this color. This amount of compression looks pretty terrible, but you can still see what's going on and understand overall what you're looking at. But it definitely does not look crisp. But to save space on a file size, or how much information is being transmitted over the internet, file compression is definitely needed. Go through some export settings so you get a good idea of what you're looking at. I'm going to just go down the list. Format. The format of file that you're going to export. Most of these are video, but to be used in different situations. H.264, I believe, is the most common, or QuickTime for high quality video. These are your presets. If you don't want to go through all the settings, for example, what are the best settings for YouTube 1080p video? We can just click there. We can add comments for the metadata, the name of the file you're exporting. Do you want to export video and audio? Here's a summary of all the settings. and a summary of the source video. In the basic video settings, we have width and height. In the basic video settings, we have pixel dimension here. We can change the frame rate of the export, but usually you're going to want to change the frame rate in the sequence settings and have it match here. The aspect ratio for internet deliveries is generally square pixels, but you may need something different if you're exporting to a tape or for a specific client who needs something for TV. If you want to render at maximum depth, you can click here. The only time I use this is when I'm having export problems and I want the maximum quality I can get. The encoder settings, hardware versus software encoding, I always leave on the default, but the difference is relying on your hardware to do the exporting, which is generally what we want to do. Or if you do software encoding, you're trying to make the whole computer system do the calculations rather than making use of your graphics card. Mastering display color volume stays the same. Content light levels is giving you extra information. Bitrate settings. Here there's a constant bitrate, variable bitrate 1 pass, or variable bitrate 2 pass. What are those differences? A constant bitrate is saying how much compression you want on every single frame. With a lot of different colors, it's going to take the same amount of information. Then for very simple frames, for example, a pure white screen, it makes sense that a pure white screen should take less information in order to display correctly and would be a waste of data to describe every single pixel color. So that's what variable bitrate means. On these simple frames, it takes less data, and on more complicated frames, it takes more data. If you do it 1 pass, the computer approximates and guesses what percentage of data to put on each frame based on its complexity. Variable bitrate 2 pass means that first, the computer goes through the entire video and looks at every frame in order to decide where the complex frames are and where the simple ones are. Then it goes back through the whole video again and does the actual export itself, calculating the correct percentage of compression it needs on the simple frames and the more complicated ones. You can say you want a target bit rate of 10, for example, but the maximum bit rate to be 16 on really complicated frames. This will translate to file size. If you have a very low target bit rate, the file size will go down. We can see estimated file size 5 megabytes, versus if I have it here, it's 19 megabytes. In this scenario, the target bit rate will be 10, and on the most complicated frame, it will go up to 16, but probably on very simple frames, it could go much lower. But on average, it will stay right at 10. In the advanced settings, we have keyframe distance, if you want to build in some keyframes into the metadata, or if you have virtual reality video that needs extra metadata, you can click that here. In the other tabs, we have effects to apply effects to your export. Most of these I like to do inside the sequence itself rather than just on the export, but you could apply a different look just for this one export, or change the brightness, or have some kind of a watermark on top of the entire video. You could use this if you're putting a watermark on top of your video if you're showing a sample to a client you don't trust. You may need to see the name of the file or the sequence for that particular export, the time code for producers who are giving you notes, or other effects on top of your video. I almost never change the audio format settings unless I have a specific request. The audio hertz don't change the file size very much, so I usually leave it at maximum. And the audio quality and bitrate the same. The multiplexer is a different way to change the file type you're exporting, and you can choose here in captions to include or not include your captions or subtitles. And in publish, you can publish straight to one of these locations instead of uploading later. For example, straight to YouTube. You'll sign in here, select the channel, the playlist, the title, so you can go straight out of Premiere, straight into YouTube. That may be very convenient. Use maximum render quality. That increases the time to export, but looks a little bit better. Import into project. If you want the export to display in your project window once it's done. If you want to make sure that your metadata timecode starts at 0, you can select here. If you want to use previews or proxies instead of the full resolution video, you can check those here. And if you want to render the alpha channel only, if you have some specific graphics that you're rendering, you can check that here. If you're including footage that you're exporting that's been slowed down or sped up, you can specify here frame sampling, frame blending, or optical flow is the way to handle those extra frames that have been added into your footage so that it flows smoothly. Each one of these has different looks, so you should probably experiment. And then here in metadata, you can add additional or subtract additional information to be included in the metadata. If you click Q, your export will go to Adobe Media Encoder, or export, it exports right here in Premiere. And cancel, that's it. Let's take a look at this graphic. This is 4K ultra high definition. This is regular full high definition. And this is standard definition. Movies on VHS and on TV until the late 2000s were in standard definition. That's about 480 pixels tall. Really small when you think about things today. Then we went from standard definition up to full high definition, which is 1080p, which stands for 1080 pixels tall, and it ends up being 1920 pixels wide. Let's look at another graphic. Standard TV, high definition, 720p, which is 720 tall, versus high definition, or 2K, which is just a little bit wider to make the horizontal count from 1920 to 2048. Then we have 4K and ultra high def, which 4K stands for 4096 pixels wide. So when you have a 4K image that you're displaying at regular high definition, you can zoom in on it only to see a quarter of the image and still have every pixel represented on your 1080 window. Therefore, you will lose zero quality if you zoom in up to 50% on a 4K image. That's why even if you're showing your video in 1080, it's still helpful to have a 4K piece of video, because if you need to zoom in for any reason, you can still have a high quality image when you export it. This is not the case when you zoom in on a regular high definition video. Now people are shooting higher than 4K, sometimes 5K or 8K, which is probably too much if your final delivery is only a 1080 piece of video, but it serves a similar purpose if your final export needs to be in 4K. You can zoom in on an 8K video and still have that 4K crispness when you export it. And that's the difference between HD, 4K, etc.